The war room at Camp Pendleton buzzed with tension as officers filed in for the morning briefing. Maps covered every wall, marking strategic positions across 3 continents where American forces were deployed. The smell of coffee mixed with the metallic scent of equipment, creating an atmosphere that spoke of serious military business. Lieutenant Sarah Chen entered the room with quiet confidence, her uniform crisp and her bearing unmistakably professional. At 28, she had already earned her place among the intelligence officers who briefed senior command on critical operations. Her slight frame and youthful appearance often caused others to underestimate her. But her record spoke volumes about her capabilities. As she moved toward her assigned seat near the front of the room, she noticed the usual mix of personnel. Colonels, majors, and captains filled most chairs, their ribbons and insignia telling stories of campaigns fought and won. The atmosphere felt familiar yet charged with the importance of the intelligence she was about to present. Staff Sergeant Mike Rodriguez sat 3 rows behind her, his massive frame filling the standard-issue chair. Rodriguez had spent 15 years in the Marines, serving tours in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria. His chest displayed an impressive array of decorations, including a Purple Heart and Bronze Star. He commanded respect wherever he went, and his opinions carried weight among the enlisted personnel. Rodriguez leaned toward Corporal James Wilson, a younger Marine with barely 2 years of service. Wilson looked up to Rodriguez like a mentor, hanging on every word the veteran shared about military life and proper protocol. "Look at that," Rodriguez whispered, his voice carrying just enough to be heard by several nearby Marines. "They got kids running intelligence briefings now. What's next? High school students, planning our operations." Wilson glanced toward Lieutenant Chen, who was organizing her presentation materials with methodical precision. "She looks pretty young, Sergeant. You sure she knows what she's doing?" Rodriguez chuckled quietly, but his tone carried an edge of disdain. "Kid, I've been fighting wars since before she could drive a car. I've seen what happens when inexperienced officers make calls that get good Marines killed. Book learning ain't the same as real experience." The conversation continued in hushed tones, but Rodriguez's voice gradually grew more audible. Other personnel in the room began to take notice, some nodding in agreement, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "I mean, look at her," Rodriguez continued, his voice now clearly audible to those around him. "Probably went straight from college to officer school. Never spent a day in the field. Never had to make a life or death decision. And they want us to trust her with classified intelligence that affects our brothers and sisters downrange?" Lieutenant Chen could hear the comments, but maintained her professional composure. She had faced similar attitudes throughout her career, particularly from senior enlisted personnel who questioned whether young officers had earned their authority. She understood their concerns came from a place of protecting their Marines, even if their methods were inappropriate. Colonel Marcus Thompson, the briefing officer, entered the room with purpose. His presence immediately commanded attention, and conversations died down as personnel prepared for the formal start of the meeting. Thompson had 30 years of military experience and was known for running tight, efficient briefings that got straight to the point. "Gentlemen and ladies," Thompson announced, "today's intelligence briefing will cover recent developments in our area of operations. Lieutenant Chen will present updated threat assessments and tactical recommendations based on the latest field reports." Rodriguez turned to Wilson again, this time speaking loud enough for half the room to hear. "Great. Now we get tactical advice from someone who probably thinks combat is what she learned playing video games." Several Marines chuckled at the comment, while others looked uncomfortable with the obvious disrespect being shown to a commissioned officer. The tension in the room became palpable as Lieutenant Chen stood to begin her presentation. She walked to the front of the room with measured steps, her bearing confident despite the hostile undercurrent she could feel from certain quarters. Years of training had prepared her for moments like this, where her authority would be tested not by enemy forces, but by members of her own military family. "Good morning," Lieutenant Chen began, her voice clear and strong. "Today's briefing will focus on intelligence gathered from our forward operating bases regarding enemy movement patterns and potential threats to our personnel." Rodriguez leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms, making no effort to hide his skeptical expression. "Here we go. he muttered, though his voice carried clearly in the now quiet room. Let's hear what the textbooks taught her about war. 1. Lieutenant Chen paused momentarily, meeting Rodriguez's gaze directly. In that moment, she made a decision that would define not just this briefing, but her approach to leadership going forward. Instead of allowing his disrespect to derail her presentation, she chose to demonstrate her competence through her work. The intelligence I'm about to share was gathered through direct coordination with our special operations teams currently engaged in high-risk missions, she continued, her voice remaining steady and professional. This information has already prevented 3 potential ambushes and saved the lives of 47 Marines and soldiers. The room fell completely silent. Even Rodriguez stopped his commentary as the weight of her words settled over the assembled personnel. Lieutenant Chen had their attention now, and she intended to keep it. She moved to the first map, pointing to specific locations marked with red pins. 48 hours ago, our forward observers reported unusual activity in this sector. Through careful analysis of communication intercepts, movement patterns, and local intelligence sources, we identified a planned attack on Supply Route, Tampa. Her presentation continued with precision and detail that impressed even the most skeptical officers present. She spoke with the confidence of someone who had not just studied warfare, but who understood the human cost of every decision made in that room. Rodriguez found himself listening despite his initial prejudice. The intelligence she presented was detailed, current, and clearly the result of careful analysis. But his pride prevented him from acknowledging what was becoming obvious to everyone else in the room. As Lieutenant Chen detailed the successful prevention of the ambush, she included specific information about the Marines, whose lives had been saved. She knew their names, their units, and even details about their families back home. This wasn't theoretical knowledge gained from textbooks. This was personal, human intelligence work that demonstrated her deep commitment to the welfare of the troops she served. The enemy had positioned themselves here, she continued, pointing to a narrow canyon on the topographical map, knowing that our standard supply convoys would be vulnerable at this choke point. However, by analyzing their previous attack patterns and cross-referencing with local intelligence reports, we were able to predict their strategy and recommend an alternative route. Wilson whispered to Rodriguez. Sounds like she knows her stuff, Sergeant. Rodriguez replied more quietly now, perhaps beginning to realize that his assumptions might have been wrong. Maybe. But knowing stuff and being able to lead in combat are 2 different things. Lieutenant Chen moved through her presentation with growing confidence, addressing questions from various officers and demonstrating not just her knowledge, but her ability to think on her feet. She fielded complex queries about logistics, enemy capabilities, and tactical implications with the skill of someone far more experienced than her appearance suggested. Colonel Thompson watched the briefing with growing approval. He had worked with Lieutenant Chen before and knew her capabilities, but he was pleased to see her handling the obvious skepticism in the room with such professionalism. This was exactly the kind of leadership the Corps needed. As the formal presentation portion concluded, the room buzzed with quiet conversations about the intelligence presented. It was clear that Lieutenant Chen had provided valuable, actionable information that would directly impact ongoing operations. Rodriguez sat back in his chair, wrestling with the realization that his initial assessment might have been unfair. He had built his opinion based on appearances and assumptions, rather than facts and performance. The intelligence briefing had been thorough, professional, and clearly the work of someone who took her responsibilities seriously. But changing his mind meant admitting he had been wrong. And that was never easy for someone who had built his reputation on being right about military matters. He decided to wait and see what else would develop before making any judgments about Lieutenant Chen's true capabilities. The briefing had been scheduled to last 30 minutes, but the quality of questions and discussion stretched it to nearly an hour. Officers wanted clarification on various points, and Lieutenant Chen handled each inquiry with patience and expertise that impressed everyone present. As the session began to wind down, Colonel Thompson prepared to dismiss the assembly when an aide entered the room and whispered something urgent in his ear. Thompson's expression changed to one of surprise, and he quickly scanned the room as if looking for someone specific. The atmosphere in the war room shifted once again, though nobody yet understood why. Lieutenant Chen gathered her materials, satisfied that she had successfully presented crucial intelligence, despite the initial hostility she had faced. She had proven herself through her work, which was all she had ever wanted to do. Rodriguez watched her pack up her presentation materials with growing respect, though he wasn't ready to admit his change of heart publicly. He had seen too many young officers fail under pressure to completely trust his new assessment. But he was beginning to understand that Lieutenant Chen might be different from his expectations. The stage was set for something unexpected, something that would challenge everyone's assumptions and change the dynamic in that war room forever. But for now, the briefing appeared to be concluding in the same way it had begun, with Lieutenant Chen proving her worth through quiet competence and professional excellence. Little did anyone in the room know that the next few minutes would reveal information that would completely transform their understanding of the young intelligence officer who had just demonstrated such remarkable capability under pressure. Colonel Thompson's expression grew increasingly serious as he continued his whispered conversation with the aide who had entered the room. The young Marine's face was flushed with excitement and what appeared to be nervousness as he delivered his urgent message. Thompson nodded several times, asked a quiet question, and then dismissed the aide with a sharp gesture. The room had grown quiet as personnel sensed something significant was happening. Lieutenant Chen finished organizing her materials but remained near the front of the room, uncertain whether the colonel needed anything else from her regarding the intelligence briefing. "Ladies and gentlemen," Colonel Thompson announced, his voice carrying an unusual tone that immediately captured everyone's attention. "Before we dismiss, I need to share some information that has just come to my attention. Information that I believe will be of particular interest to everyone present." Staff Sergeant Rodriguez shifted in his seat, wondering what could be important enough to delay the end of the briefing. He glanced at his watch, noting that he had training exercises scheduled with his unit in less than an hour. Whatever Thompson had to say, he hoped it would be brief. "It has come to my attention that one of our briefing participants today has not been properly introduced," Thompson continued, his eyes moving to Lieutenant Chen, with what appeared to be a mixture of respect and anticipation. "Lieutenant, would you please remain at the front of the room?" Chen looked puzzled but complied with the colonel's request. She wondered if there had been some error in her presentation or if additional questions needed to be addressed. Her mind quickly reviewed the intelligence she had shared, checking for any possible security concerns or inaccuracies. Thompson walked to his desk and retrieved a folder that had been delivered with the aide's message. He opened it carefully, scanning the contents with growing amazement. The information contained in those pages would change everything about how this room viewed the young intelligence officer. "How many of you are familiar with Operation Desert Storm?" Thompson asked the assembled personnel. Nearly every hand in the room went up, as this was a defining conflict for many of the senior personnel present. "And how many of you know about the Medal of Honor awarded during that conflict to Lieutenant Sarah Chen's father, Master Sergeant David Chen?" Thompson continued, his voice now carrying clear admiration. The room erupted in surprised murmurs as personnel began to understand the significance of what they were hearing. Rodriguez felt his stomach drop as he realized the implications of Thompson's words. The young officer he had been mocking was the daughter of one of the most decorated Marines in recent history. Master Sergeant David Chen received the Medal of Honor for single-handedly holding a strategic position against overwhelming enemy forces, allowing the evacuation of his entire unit, Thompson explained, reading from the folder. His actions saved the lives of 37 Marines and changed the course of that particular battle. Lieutenant Chen stood frozen at the front of the room, clearly uncomfortable with the sudden attention being focused on her family history. She had worked hard throughout her career to be judged on her own merits, rather than her father's legendary service record. But that's not all. Thompson continued, his voice growing stronger with each revelation. "How many of you served in Iraq during the second deployment in 2004? Several hands went up around the room, including Rodriguez's. He was beginning to feel increasingly uncomfortable as he sensed where this conversation was heading. Master Sergeant Chen was also awarded the Navy Cross for his actions during the Battle of Fallujah, Thompson read from the file. He led a rescue mission that saved 12 wounded Marines from an ambush, sustaining severe injuries in the process but refusing medical evacuation until all his men were safe. The silence in the room was deafening as the weight of this information settled over the assembled Marines. Rodriguez felt his face burning with embarrassment as he realized he had spent the morning disrespecting the daughter of a man he considered a genuine hero. Wilson leaned toward Rodriguez and whispered, "Sergeant, isn't Master Sergeant Chen the guy you always tell stories about? The one you said was the toughest Marine you ever met?" Rodriguez could only nod, his throat tight with emotion and shame. David Chen had indeed been his idol, a Marine whose courage and leadership had inspired an entire generation of service members, and he had just spent an hour mocking and belittling Chen's daughter. Thompson wasn't finished with his revelations. Master Sergeant Chen completed 4 combat tours before transitioning to intelligence work, where he developed many of the analysis techniques still used today in our current operations. His methods have been credited with saving thousands of lives over the past 2 decades. Lieutenant Chen finally found her voice. "Colonel, with respect, I don't think my father's service record is relevant to today's briefing. I prefer to be evaluated based on my own work and capabilities." Her response demonstrated the same quiet strength and professionalism that had characterized her entire presentation, even when facing disrespect from Rodriguez. She wasn't trying to trade on her father's reputation. She wanted to succeed on her own merit. Thompson smiled at her response. "Lieutenant, your preference is noted and respected. However, there's more information here that I think is relevant to how we view leadership and experience in our Corps." He turned back to the assembled personnel, many of whom were now looking at Rodriguez with expressions ranging from sympathy to disapproval. Everyone could see how uncomfortable the staff sergeant had become as the true identity of his target became clear. "Master Sergeant Chen didn't just serve with distinction," Thompson continued. "He spent his final 5 years in service training intelligence officers, including his daughter. Lieutenant Chen didn't learn about warfare from textbooks or video games. She learned from one of the most combat-experienced Marines in our history." The colonel's words hit Rodriguez like a physical blow. Every assumption he had made about Lieutenant Chen's background and experience had been completely wrong. She hadn't been coddled or fast-tracked through the system. She had been trained by a legend. Lieutenant Chen completed her initial training under her father's direct supervision. Thompson read from the file. She then served 2 tours in Afghanistan as an intelligence analyst, before being selected for advanced training at the Defense Intelligence Agency. Her work has already been credited with preventing 17 separate attacks on American forces. Rodriguez found himself remembering conversations he'd had with other Marines about Master Sergeant Chen's daughter. He recalled hearing that David Chen had a child following in his footsteps, but he had never connected that information with the young lieutenant he had been dismissing all morning. The irony was overwhelming. Rodriguez had spent years telling younger Marines stories about David Chen's courage, leadership, and dedication to his fellow Marines. He had held Chen up as an example of everything a Marine should aspire to be. And now he had spent an entire morning showing disrespect to Chen's daughter, who was clearly following in her father's footsteps. Thompson closed the folder and looked directly at Rodriguez. "Staff Sergeant, I believe you served under Master Sergeant Chen during your 2nd deployment to Iraq. Is that correct?" Rodriguez stood up slowly, his face pale but his bearing still proud despite his obvious distress. "Yes, sir. Master Sergeant Chen was my company's senior enlisted advisor. He saved my life during an ambush outside Ramadi." The admission hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. Every person in the room now understood the full scope of what had transpired. Rodriguez had spent the morning mocking the daughter of the man who had saved his life. "I see," Thompson replied simply, allowing the weight of Rodriguez's words to settle over the room. "And what was your assessment of Master Sergeant Chen's leadership abilities?" Rodriguez's voice was barely above a whisper as he replied, "He was the finest Marine I ever served with, sir. His courage and tactical knowledge were unmatched. He taught me everything I know about being a leader." Lieutenant Chen turned to look at Rodriguez for the first time since the revelations began. Instead of anger or satisfaction at his obvious discomfort, her expression showed only understanding. and perhaps a touch of sympathy. She recognized the position he found himself in, and she took no pleasure in his embarrassment. "Staff Sergeant," she said quietly, her voice carrying clearly in the silent room. "My father always said that good Marines question everything, including their officers. Your concerns about inexperienced leadership getting Marines killed are valid and important. I would rather have sergeants who care enough to ask hard questions than ones who follow orders blindly." Her response was perfectly calibrated to address Rodriguez's concerns while maintaining her authority. She wasn't excusing his disrespectful behavior, but she was acknowledging the legitimate military concerns that had motivated it. Thompson watched this exchange with growing respect for both Marines. Rodriguez was clearly struggling with his mistake, but he was facing it with the same courage he had shown in combat. Lieutenant Chen was demonstrating the kind of leadership that could turn a difficult situation into a learning opportunity for everyone present. "There's one more piece of information from this file that I think everyone should know," Thompson announced, his voice carrying a note of pride that surprised many in the room. He opened the folder one final time and pulled out a single sheet of paper that appeared to be an official military communication. The header was clearly visible from several feet away, indicating it had come from the highest levels of military command. "This morning, before Lieutenant Chen's briefing, I received notification that her intelligence work over the past 6 months has been personally commended by the Secretary of Defense," Thompson read from the document. "Her analysis has been instrumental in planning 3 major operations currently underway, and her recommendations have been adopted as standard protocol for intelligence gathering in active combat zones." The room was completely silent as personnel absorbed this final piece of information. Lieutenant Chen had not just proven herself as David Chen's daughter, she had earned recognition at the highest levels of military and civilian leadership. Rodriguez felt the last of his resistance crumble as he realized the full scope of his error. He had questioned the competence of someone whose work was being praised by the nation's top defense officials. His assumption-based assessment had been not just wrong, but spectacularly wrong. The morning's events had revealed layers of truth that challenged everyone's preconceptions about youth, experience, and leadership. What had begun as a routine intelligence briefing had become a powerful lesson about the dangers of judging others based on appearances rather than performance. The tension in the war room had reached its peak when the sound of approaching footsteps echoed from the corridor outside. Colonel Thompson paused in his reading of Lieutenant Chen's commendations, his head turning toward the door with an expression of sudden alertness. The steady, measured pace of the approaching steps suggested someone of significant authority was heading their way. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez remained standing at attention, his face still flushed with the embarrassment of his morning's behavior toward Lieutenant Chen. The weight of his mistakes pressed down on him like the desert heat he remembered from his deployments with her father. Every revelation about her background and accomplishments had made his assumptions look more foolish and unprofessional. The footsteps stopped just outside the war room door, followed by a brief conversation between what sounded like 2 people. Personnel in the room exchanged glances, wondering who might be arriving at such an unusual time. Standard protocol called for all relevant attendees to be present at the beginning of briefings, not appearing unexpectedly in the middle of proceedings. Lieutenant Chen remained at the front of the room, her composure intact, despite the uncomfortable attention that had been focused on her family history. She appreciated Colonel Thompson's defense of her credentials, but she wished the focus could return to the mission-critical intelligence she had presented rather than her personal background. The door to the war room opened with a soft click, and an aide stepped inside with obvious nervousness. The young Marine's eyes quickly scanned the room, before settling on Colonel Thompson with an expression that suggested something very important was happening. "Colonel Thompson, sir," the aide announced in a voice that carried clearly through the silent room. "Admiral Richardson requests permission to enter for an urgent matter regarding today's intelligence briefing." The room erupted in surprised murmurs as personnel realized that a flag officer was about to join their gathering. Admiral Richardson was the base commander, a 3-star admiral whose presence at a routine intelligence briefing was highly unusual and suggested something significant was occurring. Thompson immediately called the room to attention. "Admiral on deck," he commanded, and every person present snapped to their feet with military precision. Rodriguez found himself grateful for the familiar ritual of military protocol. which provided structure during his continued emotional turmoil. Admiral James Richardson entered the room with the quiet authority that marked senior flag officers. At 58 years old, he had commanded ships in 3 different conflicts and had earned a reputation as both a strategic thinker and someone who genuinely cared about the welfare of his personnel. His presence immediately elevated the importance of whatever was about to occur. "As you were," Admiral Richardson announced, and the assembled personnel relaxed slightly while remaining at attention. His eyes moved around the room, taking in the situation before settling on Lieutenant Chen with an expression that seemed to combine recognition with something approaching reverence. "Colonel Thompson," the Admiral began, his voice carrying the weight of authority earned through decades of leadership, "I understand that Lieutenant Chen has just completed an intelligence briefing regarding current operations in our area of responsibility." "Yes, sir," Thompson replied. "The lieutenant presented crucial intelligence that has already prevented multiple attacks on our forces." Her analysis was thorough and highly professional. Admiral Richardson nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving Lieutenant Chen. "I'm not surprised to hear that, Colonel. Lieutenant Chen's work has been brought to my attention through channels that extend well beyond this base and our immediate command structure." The Admiral walked closer to where Lieutenant Chen stood, his expression growing more serious with each step. Rodriguez watched this interaction with growing confusion, wondering what could possibly bring a base commander to personally address a lieutenant after a routine briefing. "Lieutenant Chen," Admiral Richardson said, his voice now addressing her directly, "I've received communications from Washington regarding your intelligence work over the past several months, specifically your analysis of enemy communication patterns and your predictions regarding their tactical adaptations." Chen maintained her professional bearing, though her surprise at the Admiral's personal attention was evident. "Thank you, sir. I was simply doing my assigned duties to the best of my ability." Richardson smiled slightly at her response. "Lieutenant, your assigned duties may have been routine intelligence analysis, but your results have been anything but routine. Your work has been briefed to the Joint Chiefs of Staff and has influenced strategic planning at the highest levels of our military command." The room fell completely silent as personnel absorbed the implications of the Admiral's words. Rodriguez felt another wave of shame wash over him as he realized he had spent the morning mocking someone whose work was influencing decisions at the Pentagon. "Sir," Lieutenant Chen responded carefully, "if my analysis has been useful to our strategic planners, I'm honored to have contributed to our mission's success. However, I want to emphasize that my work builds on intelligence gathered by many brave Marines and sailors who risk their lives to collect actionable information." Her response demonstrated the same humility and focus on the larger mission that had characterized her entire presentation. Even when receiving praise from a flag officer, she deflected credit to the personnel in the field whose dangerous work made her analysis possible. Admiral Richardson's respect for her response was obvious in his expression. "Lieutenant, that attitude is exactly why your work has been so effective. You understand that intelligence analysis isn't an academic exercise, but a critical component of keeping our people safe." He turned to address the entire room, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to addressing large groups of military personnel. "What many of you may not realize is that Lieutenant Chen's father, Master Sergeant David Chen, was personally responsible for training some of our most effective intelligence officers over the past decade. His methods and approaches have become standard curriculum at our advanced training facilities." Rodriguez closed his eyes briefly, feeling the weight of his morning's behavior crushing down on him. Not only had he disrespected the daughter of a man he considered a hero, but he had questioned the competence of someone whose family had literally written the book on modern military intelligence analysis. "However," Admiral Richardson continued, "I'm not here today because of Lieutenant Chen's father's reputation or her family's service record. I'm here because of her own achievements and the recognition they have earned." The Admiral reached into his uniform pocket and withdrew a small presentation case that immediately drew everyone's attention. The significance of such cases was well known to all military personnel present. They typically contained decorations or awards being presented for exceptional service. "Lieutenant Chen," Admiral Richardson announced, his voice now carrying the formal tone used for ceremonial occasions, By direction of the Secretary of Defense and recommendation of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, you are hereby awarded the Defense Meritorious Service Medal for exceptionally meritorious service in support of combat operations. The room erupted in surprised applause as personnel realized they were witnessing an actual award ceremony. Such recognitions were typically handled in formal settings with family members present, making this impromptu presentation highly unusual and therefore more significant. Lieutenant Chen's composure finally cracked slightly as she realized what was happening. Her eyes widened with genuine surprise and what appeared to be emotional overwhelm at receiving such recognition. The Defense Meritorious Service Medal was a significant honor, particularly for someone of her rank and experience. Admiral Richardson opened the presentation case, revealing the distinctive medal with its red, white, and blue ribbon. Lieutenant, your intelligence analysis directly contributed to the successful planning and execution of Operation Iron Shield, which protected American and Allied forces from what intelligence indicates would have been coordinated attacks, resulting in significant casualties. As he prepared to present the medal, Admiral Richardson did something that shocked everyone in the room. The three-star admiral, a man whose authority was absolute on this base, and whose rank commanded respect from colonels and generals alike, came to attention and rendered a perfect military salute to Lieutenant Chen. The gesture was unprecedented and powerful. Flag officers did not typically salute junior officers, even when presenting awards. Richardson's salute was a clear statement of his personal respect for Chen's accomplishments and a visible demonstration of how military leadership should recognize excellence, regardless of rank or seniority. Rodriguez felt his legs tremble as he watched the scene unfold. The contrast between his morning behavior and Admiral Richardson's demonstration of respect was overwhelming. He had questioned Lieutenant Chen's competence, while one of the Navy's most senior officers was saluting her achievements. Lieutenant Chen returned the Admiral's salute with crisp precision, her emotional composure restored by the familiar ritual of military protocol. As Richardson pinned the medal to her uniform, the room maintained complete silence, recognizing the historical significance of the moment they were witnessing. "Ladies and gentlemen," Admiral Richardson announced to the assembled personnel, "you have just witnessed excellence being recognized, but more importantly, you have seen an example of what our military values most: competence, dedication, and results that protect American lives." The Admiral's eyes moved around the room, making contact with various personnel before settling briefly on Rodriguez. His expression was not accusatory, but it carried an unmistakable message about the importance of recognizing merit rather than making assumptions based on appearance or preconceptions. This presentation also serves as a reminder that leadership and expertise come in many forms. Richardson continued, "Our effectiveness as a military organization depends on our ability to recognize and support excellence wherever we find it, regardless of whether it matches our expectations or preconceptions." Rodriguez knew the Admiral's words were directed at everyone present, but he felt them as a personal rebuke of his morning's behavior. The lesson being taught was clear. Judging others based on assumptions rather than performance was not just unprofessional, but potentially dangerous in a military context. As the ceremony concluded, Admiral Richardson shook Lieutenant Chen's hand and spoke with her quietly for several moments. Their conversation was private, but his respectful demeanor and her obvious appreciation for his recognition created a powerful image of military leadership at its best. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez," Admiral Richardson called out, causing every person in the room to turn their attention to the embarrassed Marine. "I understand you served under Master Sergeant Chen during your deployment to Iraq." Rodriguez stepped forward, his bearing military correct despite his internal turmoil. "Yes, sir. Master Sergeant Chen was an exemplary leader who taught me the true meaning of Marine Corps values." "I'm sure he did," Admiral Richardson replied with a slight smile. "And I suspect he would be proud to see that his daughter has not only inherited his dedication to excellence, but has also developed her own distinctive approach to serving our nation." The Admiral's words were carefully chosen to provide Rodriguez with an opportunity to demonstrate the values that Master Sergeant Chen had taught him. It was a moment for redemption, a chance to show that he had learned something important from the morning's events. Rodriguez looked directly at Lieutenant Chen, his voice steady despite his obvious emotion. "Lieutenant, I owe you an apology. My behavior this morning was unprofessional and unworthy of the standards your father taught me. You proved your competence through your work, and I should have recognized that instead of making assumptions based on ignorance." His apology was direct, honest, and delivered without excuses or attempts to minimize his mistakes. It demonstrated the kind of accountability that military leadership demanded and showed that he had indeed learned important lessons from Master Sergeant Chen's example. Lieutenant Chen's response was immediate and gracious. "Staff Sergeant, your apology is accepted. More importantly, your questions about experience and leadership were legitimate concerns that good NCOs should raise. I hope we can work together in the future to ensure our Marines receive the best possible intelligence support." Her ability to transform Rodriguez's hostility into an opportunity for future collaboration demonstrated exactly the kind of leadership that had earned her recognition from the highest levels of military command. She had proven herself not just as an analyst but as a leader capable of building bridges and creating positive outcomes from difficult situations. Admiral Richardson watched this exchange with obvious approval before addressing the entire room one final time. Today's events provide us all with important reminders about the nature of military excellence. Competence must be recognized and supported regardless of its source. Leadership can emerge from unexpected places, and our mission's success depends on our ability to work together effectively, regardless of our personal assumptions or preconceptions. As the Admiral prepared to leave, he turned back to Lieutenant Chen with a final comment that would resonate with everyone present. "Lieutenant, your father would be proud of what you've accomplished today. But more importantly, you've earned this recognition through your own merit and dedication. Continue to serve with the same excellence you've demonstrated, and there's no limit to what you can achieve in service to our nation." The war room slowly emptied as personnel returned to their regular duties. But the impact of the morning's events would last far longer than the briefing itself. Rodriguez walked past Lieutenant Chen on his way out, pausing briefly to offer his hand in a gesture of respect and professional courtesy. "Thank you, Lieutenant," he said simply, "for the intelligence briefing, for handling my disrespect with professionalism, and for reminding me about the values your father taught me." Their handshake represented more than just the resolution of morning tensions. It symbolized the kind of mutual respect and professional cooperation that made military organizations effective in accomplishing their missions. As Lieutenant Chen gathered her materials and prepared to leave the war room, she reflected on the unexpected turn the morning had taken. She had come to deliver a routine intelligence briefing and found herself receiving a significant military decoration while teaching important lessons about leadership, respect, and the danger of assumptions. The medal now pinned to her uniform represented recognition for her professional achievements. But the morning's events had proven something equally important about her character and leadership potential. She had transformed a hostile situation into an opportunity for learning and growth, demonstrating exactly the kind of skills that would serve her well as she continued to advance in her military career. The war room returned to its normal quiet state. Maps still covering the walls, and the smell of coffee still hanging in the air. But something fundamental had changed in that space. It had become the setting for a powerful demonstration of how military excellence should be recognized and supported, regardless of expectations or preconceptions. For everyone who witnessed the morning's events, the lesson was clear. True leadership means recognizing merit wherever it exists and supporting excellence however it manifests. Lieutenant Chen had earned her recognition through competence and dedication, and Admiral Richardson had demonstrated how senior leadership should respond to such achievement. The story would be retold countless times throughout the base and beyond, serving as a reminder that assumptions based on appearance or prejudice have no place in professional military environments. Excellence must be recognized, supported, and celebrated, regardless of its source or whether it matches our expectations. Most importantly, the morning had demonstrated that military values, like honor, courage, and commitment, are not abstract concepts, but practical guides for daily behavior. When those values are lived out authentically, they create opportunities for growth, learning, and mutual respect that strengthened the entire organization.